Wow. Oh, hey there. My name's Ross, and I'm a bit of a nerd for all things nature. So a while ago, I started a passion project called, Nerdy About Nature. It began as social media videos sharing cool fun facts and tidbits of wisdom about the natural world, and has since evolved into this podcast that you're tuning into here. This project serves as a means to inspire, educate, and engage folks with the outdoor world so that we can all become better stewards of it, and so that we can all work together to create a more inclusive, diverse, equitable, and just future for each and every one of us in this world that we all share. Because nature, it's pretty dang neat, you know? I think we should keep it that way. So come on, let's go get nerdy about nature. Come and take a nature walk with me. We're gonna check out some really cool trees. We're gonna hang around and talk about all those things in nature that we can't live without. Let's go get nerdy, yeah, let's get nerdy about nature. Nerdy, yeah, let's get nerdy about nature, baby. Nerdy, yeah, let's get nerdy about nature. Come on, let's get nerdy about nature. What is up, my fellow nerds? Welcome, everybody, to the Nerdy About Nature podcast. My name is Ross. I'm your host, and I'm currently sitting in a forest. I would naturally say that it's an old-growth forest, purely because there's a couple old-growth big western red cedars over there, a cool, really cool candelabra top, a couple really old hemlocks, which you don't see very often around here. And these trees are certainly over 250 years old, yet at the same time, I'm also within the town limits of the town of... I'm on an old logging road, which you can see, we've got some alders sprouting up behind me here, some successional species trying to reclaim this piece of land. And that leads to, a clear-cut development area where there's going to be houses in a few years. So, yes, this is a forest. Is it an old-growth forest? Is it an intact old-growth forest ecosystem? Does it perform all the ecological functions that an old-growth forest is supposed to? Does it contain the level of biodiversity that this area naturally would have had prior to Western human engagement? I don't know. These are all really deep questions, and it leads me into the conversation I had with today's guest, because today's guest, she's kind of a big deal, Dr. Rachel Holt. Now, if you're not familiar with that name, Rachel is an ecologist based out of Nelson, British Columbia, and she's one of three authors, along with Karen Price and Dave Dost, of a really monumental report that came out in 2020 called BC's Last Stand for Biodiversity. Now, hopefully that rings some bells, because this report was a massive thing when it came out. It was huge, incredibly impactful, an independently produced research paper, peer-reviewed, that basically detailed the dire situation we're in here in British Columbia with the lack of remaining old-growth forest. Lack of intact old-growth forest, what it means, why that's a big deal, and kind of the future that's going to create for us. Now, these calculations that they did, it also went to be contributed to and helped aid the Old Growth Strategic Review, which was a government document written by Al Gorley and Gary Merkel that kind of outlined the state of forests in British Columbia and what the province needs to do moving forward in order to preserve them and protect them, as well as the industry, and whether or not, they're actually taking those recommendations. Rachel and I are going to talk about that, so stay tuned. But basically, I'm just incredibly stoked, humbled, and honored to have been able to talk to Rachel, because, I don't get starstruck very often, and she's definitely one of those people where I was like, whoa, you're a big deal. So pretty cool. Now, outside of this whole Nerdy About Nature thing, I'm actually an independent filmmaker, so I had originally met up with Rachel to record some video interviews for SAFT, which is the Science Alliance for Forestry Transformation. Great organization there. Highly recommend you all check it out. Some heavy hitters on that team. So when Rachel and I finally got around to recording this podcast, it was after we had done all that SAFT stuff. It was the end of the day. We were both tired, thirsty, hungry, a little hangry, and we had limited time because Rachel had prior commitments. So we had literally been talking about this stuff all day, so we might seem a little bit burnt out, and a lot of this conversation might seem a little bit abrupt if you were to just jump into it. So what I've decided to do is I've compiled some of those interviews from that SAFT interview, some highlights here that I'm going to play before our conversation, which is just going to give you a background on all these issues and help make that conversation a little bit easier to get into. So let's hear what she has to say.
So British Columbia is this amazing place. It's incredibly biodiverse in the world. It's because of the complexity of the topography and the closeness to the sea, but also continental. It has this incredible range of ecosystems. So it's extremely biodiverse, and that means there's many, many species all interacting with each other. There's on the order of a British Columbia province report talks about there being about 50,000 species in the province. only around 4,000 of which we have any sense of the conservation status of. And every time we look somewhere, if we look into the canopy of a single old growth tree, we find new species, we find new mites, we find new spiders. And when we look into the soil, we find an increasing diversity of soil organisms of many different kinds, hundreds of species of soil mycorrhiza, for example. All of these things, they do something in the ecosystem. And some of them are really obvious, like beavers are ecosystem engineers, or sea otters are kelp engineers, and they create ecosystem diversity. Many species, we don't even know what they do. And so that's why it's really important to have that biodiversity so that there's some redundancy in the system. All of those things do something and they interact together. And when we lose them, we either see change, we lose all the salmon, or we don't see the change immediately and the system can potentially be unraveling and we don't even know until something doesn't work anymore. Healthy land and water, or healthy ecosystems, is a place where all the natural biodiversity that exists there is present in its natural form and distribution, and where all the interactions between all those species still happen, and where all the functions that happen from that ecosystem can also function. So those are healthy ecosystems. And healthy ecosystems are also something that are resilient. They are resilient to the stress, and they can maintain themselves when stressed, and they can bounce back or they can adapt to stress over time. So it's really important that there is the full complement of species and distribution, and that the system is able to be robust to stresses. So a healthy ecosystem does many things. At the most basic level, it provides all the habitat for all the species that we know and love, and those that we don't know and we don't yet love. So the elk and the moose and the obvious things, the bears, the caribou. So there has to be habitat for those things, but those things also need to move, and everything moves. Even things that are stationary, they actually move in landscapes. Particularly with climate, we're going to need more movability within our landscape. So a functioning ecosystem allows connectivity between areas at many different scales, from whole landscapes to within watersheds, to just within site levels. Ecosystems, healthy ecosystems, they filter the water, they keep the water cool, that's a huge one. They store carbon, they create soil. Well, they use the energy of the sun and create nutrients, and then move nutrients around between bears and salmon and fungus, and this incredible diverse interaction of ecosystems. All these things and many more that we do not understand. And that's a huge piece of managing for ecosystem health, is understanding that there is much more diversity than we will ever understand. So British Columbia is 95 million hectares, about half of which, about 50 million hectares of which, are forested ecosystems. We are a system of forests, many diverse different types of forests. Our forest management, the industrial forest management of the last 120, 140 years, shorter in some places, what it's done is it's taken the really complex older forests and truncated them. We log old forests or primary forests and then turn them into second growth and now third growth plantation forests. And those forests are vastly more simple than their original forests. So we have simplified the forest landscape at all scales, from the big scale down to the smallest cut block level. So we've lost species diversity. When you harvest, you lose the species that are on the ground for some period of time. And yes, forests regenerate, but it's really the structural complexity that has disappeared in our historic approach to forest management. In the big picture, simplified forests, which is what we have created through forest management in the last century of industrial forestry. Simplified forests have lost a significant amount of their biodiversity and of their ecosystem functioning. And that is the key thing that we need to undo if we want to manage for healthy ecosystems going forward. At the broad scale, we have a set of protected areas, and they very well represent the high elevation and lower productivity forest ecosystems in the province, and they extremely poorly represent the higher productivity and the low elevation ecosystems in the province. So that is a significant problem up front of having a lack of core representation in protected areas. But at the policy level within the forested land base, we have talked about managing for ecosystem health for a long time. So in the mid 90s, there was policy to set up old growth protection and manage for connectivity across landscapes, manage for mature forests in order to maintain a future supply of old forests. There was a lot of policy put together to do that work. It was relatively weak from an ecological perspective at that time, but it was certainly in the right direction. And a lot of that work was never implemented. And so that has really led now to a forested landscape that you can drive, and I've just did, having spent time both in the inland temperate rainforest and on the coastal temperate rainforest, but across the province, endless hours of driving through dense second growth forest that is lacking in structure, that is lacking in riparian protection, that doesn't provide habitat for anything, that doesn't have any understory, that has cut out the habitat components across entire valleys. And from that perspective, we've done a really poor job of managing for ecosystem health. That has implications to all the species and to all those functions that I talked about. So ecologists have known that we need to do this for forever, for a long time, that we need to keep that structure in place at all scales. And the recent old growth strategic review, the Gawley-Merkel report commissioned by the provincial government, it came to the same conclusion and said that we had been for too long managing with a focus on timber, and that we needed to really shift that and manage instead for a focus on ecosystem health. British Columbia is a very interesting place. It's very green. It looks green, but with a little bit of understanding of different shades of green, what I see when I drive through or fly over the province or look at satellite imagery is I see that there are old growth forests remaining, but they tend to be at high elevation or on low productivity sites. There is very, very little low elevation old growth remaining anywhere in British Columbia. And what has taken its place is a landscape that is full of second and third growth forests that are usually dark, have very little understory in them, that don't maintain, that have lost a significant proportion of their soil, that have lost a lot of their ability to perform the functions that we are understanding to be key to ecosystem health. And although we had talked about managing in this way in the 90s, the reason that never got implemented properly, and I was part of some of those conversations early on, and I know the intention was to do a good job and switch the focus and manage the forest better. We didn't implement them because we hit not a glass ceiling, but a timber supply cap ceiling. What that means was, although the intention was to do a good job, the people who ran the forestry world were in charge and said, well, you can do this, but only if it is done within a 4.1% timber supply cap. So you can impact the productive forest land base by 4.1%. That means you can have as much of the forest as you like that we don't want to log. But of the productive forest that we do want to log, we'll have 4% of it managed for nature. And when there's an argument about whether we should be managing for 50% or 30% or 70% for nature, we have to remember that here in British Columbia, we're managing at around 4%. That is what we've designated to maintain the natural biodiversity. And there was another 1% that we managed, that we allowed to impact timber supply, to manage for all the identified wildlife that was in a separate strategy. And so the fundamental problem is that although we know what to do, and we have been attempting to implement these strategies, we always have to implement them within this timber supply cap. So that means we put aside areas that we don't want to log, and when we are going to put something aside, we put it in a place where we weren't going to log, to a maximum of about 5% of the productive forest land base, because there's a 4.1% cap for this old growth protection, and then there's a 1% cap for managing for habitat for everything else. And that has limited our ability to maintain ecosystem health in the province. Well, the Old Growth Strategic Review used the term paradigm shift, and what they talked about is, I think, really central. It's shifting our relationship with nature. It is changing how we view the forests and what the forests give us. Right now, in policy, the primary thing, the only thing that we directly manage for is timber supply. And what we have to do is switch it and think about all the other values and species that the forest provides. That is what a paradigm shift is. So it's a mental framework, and frankly, without that mental framework, we will fail at this task. We have to appreciate the forest for the other values. Otherwise, we're always trying to make something happen when the people on the ground don't believe in it or understand in it, and we will fail unless there's that broader paradigm shift. There's a whole bunch of kind of crazy policy things that exist out there that are hard to believe even exist. But for instance, the current law says that we're going to maintain water. We're going to maintain cultural values. We're going to maintain the biodiversity. We're going to maintain the soil. We're going to do all of these things without unduly impacting the timber supply of the province. Those are the current written words. And unless we take that off, unless we shift that, we need to scratch it out right now in the policy. That would have no actual direct impact, is removing the words. But what it would do is it would allow then an ability to implement a management regime that actually put ecosystem health first. We have clauses that say you can maintain your old growth for 45% of the province is designated low biodiversity. And in those places, you can draw down the old forest target to around 3%. It differs ever so slightly in different ecosystems. And you can manage for old growth 250 years into the future. You can log today's 1,000-year-old forest, set it aside, and say it's your old growth management area for the future. That's crazy speak. That makes no sense, and that clearly will not get us through into a resilient ecosystem world. So that needs to change. We need to put more science-based targets in place. All of these things are actually talked about in the Old Growth Strategic Review. So what we actually need to do is full on get that and implement it. We need to prioritize ecosystem health. And so while taking away the things that currently limit our ability to manage for ecosystem health, we actually need to really get on and quickly put in place an Ecosystem Health Act that forces us to manage at multiple scales to maintain all these ecosystem function and make sure that we measure those and actually do it right. As I said, we know how to do this. We just have not got on with doing it.
Wow, a lot of great facts, stats, percentages, a lot of really great info there that takes a bit to soak in and absorb. So maybe before we jump into this conversation that I had with Rachel, let's just all take a moment here and breathe, let that soak in. And actually, this is a perfect time to jump in, if I may, and remind you all that Nerdy About Nature is an independently funded passion project that relies solely on support from folks just like yourself. So if you're enjoying these podcasts and all the fun educational video content that I put out all over social media, you can help fund their production by becoming a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/nerdyboutnature. Of course, you can do it, not right now, but after this podcast. I wouldn't want to, interrupt your listening to any really great conversations. Which, speaking of which, maybe it's about time we just quit lollygagging. Let's get into this conversation here with Rachel. Here we go. So first off, thank you for coming to the podcast. I'm super stoked to have you here.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks.
Would you like to start by introducing yourself, who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name is Rachel Holt. My son calls me Dr. Rachel Holt because I make him. I'm an ecologist. I've lived in British Columbia for most of my life, which is strange because I grew up in the north of England. But I've lived in the forests of BC for the last 30 years and in Nelson for the last 25. And I run a little consulting company that is just me, Viridian Ecological Consulting. And I've worked on forests and forest management issues in BC for that time.
Nice. I didn't realize that you were the one behind Viridian. I've heard of Viridian.
Yeah, that's me.
So you're from Northern England. How did you get involved in British Columbia and forests in the first place? Where did you first fall in love with forests?
Well, it wasn't in England because there isn't much for forest there.
Right.
I grew up in a place where the original forests were gone 400 years ago. The last wolf was shot there about that length of time ago, and they're forever talking about putting those things back, and it's obviously really hard. I grew up in a cultural landscape, which I really do love, and but I'm an ecologist, and so I had done a zoology and plant science degree there, and I was interested in going somewhere else, so I kind of scoured around, and I heard about British Columbia, and really the idea that there were massive old-growth forests, primary forests, where seabirds nested in the tops of the trees. I mean, that's kind of crazy. Whales, bears, the idea for an ecologist in this world to be in a place where the full ecosystem is intact in some places, that's pretty mind-blowing. So the idea of, I was always interested in conservation, and the idea of coming somewhere where there's the possibility of having a functional ecosystem was incredibly exciting to me. Do
you remember that first time you came over and immersed yourself in an old growth forest? What was that like? Yeah, well, it was pretty amazing. I guess I got to, I kind of sat through my PhD at the School of Forestry at UBC, and I was there in 92, and then in 93 Clayoquot Sound happened. So kind of out of the blue, without any without much context, I came to listen to the debate about forests, and I went and looked at some forests, and honestly didn't know a huge amount about the history and context at that time, but started to study the ecology, and I do remember going to the big forests and driving to out to the west coast and going to Cathedral Grove and being blown away by the possibility. And at that point I didn't understand the context and didn't really have the big picture, but I was tempted to go home and back to England at that point, but realized that there was something really important here in the province, and that I should stay here and work on it here because it was super interesting. And did you ever get out to Clayoquot? I did. During the protests and everything? I did. I went there. So, and that was right when you were starting your forestry degree. So you're a student of that first generation of reform in a way. Yeah, so I wasn't, I was working on my PhD at that time, more on landscape ecology, and I just happened to have a desk in the forestry department. And so I would listen to things that didn't make sense to me, like the idea that logging ancient forests, really old forest, was sustainable. I mean, it's a misnomer. It makes no sense. It's not coming back. And of course, then I realized that is the model. That's a success. The success from a forest management perspective, and I think that's part of the trouble that we have, is foresters are educated in the idea that it is a success to log all the old growth and turn it into a simplified managed forest and keep turning that over for
however many rotations, that's what they think their job is. And although I know that School of Forestry has somewhat changed, it hasn't radically changed, because I talk to a lot of young foresters who still don't understand ecosystem complexity. And so, I just came at this from afresh and really felt that, things didn't make a whole bunch of sense. And at that time, the Faculty of Forestry was about maintaining the forest industry, very much full on. And I come from a place where academia meant something different, and it was a bit of a stark. It was a bit of a stark thing at first to get used to understand that that's how it worked here.
Yeah, I mean, and very much still today, like forests are still managed for timber being the number one value.
Yeah, they certainly are. And we haven't, we're just on the cusp of thinking about carbon as something that we can put money on, but we don't value forests at this moment for their water supply. I mean, we're insane. Humans are quite insane how we think about the value of ecosystems, and again, we've talked about this forever, externalizing the costs and not doing full cost accounting and not putting value on the things. You can't eat money.
Right.
You can eat salmon, but we've decimated salmon stocks. It's taken me 30 years to understand how bad it really is. When I go and work with nations who literally their salmon are gone in their local creeks, and it's a culmination of different things for sure, or bad management on the fishing end, and really bad land management plus climate change. All of the things are coming together. But if we can't value these forests for maintaining things as obvious as salmon, a huge economic wealth, a huge cultural wealth, a huge part of ecosystem functioning, we haven't even done that. Honestly, we don't even manage the forest well for timber. Like, we're on first cut at this point, and the loss of productivity as we go from primary growth forests through to second growth is phenomenal. The amount of soil that is lost. Like, if we wanted to just grow trees, we're actually doing that badly.
Right. And as far as quality of timber goes too, there's so much, like the second growth forests that are coming up today that are being harvested are such lower quality of timber.
That's right.
There's not even any value for them really overseas even.
That's right.
So how does it feel? I mean, so if you were over here back in the original, like, War of the Woods style, how does it feel that I've seen Fairy Creek kind of occur last year? And like, for the first time in 30 years, we're having these like massive societal wide conversations about this subject again. How does it feel to kind of be at that same place 30 years later?
Well, it's a little bit distressing. I will say, we've had all of I feel like I've had the same conversation over and over again over this last time period. And, we had an interesting, I think, a shift backwards. We were on the cusp of doing something different and talking about, really developing value-added industry in the province back in the late 90s, putting in real protection for ecosystems. We didn't use the words ecosystem health at that time, but there was definitely we need to really shift how we're managing. We need to move away from clear cutting. All of those things were right on the table back then. And then we went back to the Dark Ages, consolidated tenure, moved back to spaghetti mills, moved away from the little mills and little towns, got rid of appurtenancy, which meant that if your watershed was logged, at least you kept the wood close to home. All the little mills shut down. Now there's 5 majors who have the vast majority of the timber supply, and think a value-added product is a 2x4.
What caused that kind of backslide to occur? Like, if we were at a place when, like, the public, it's on the forefront, like, people are talking about it, it's like on all the news coverage, it was the biggest act of civil disobedience at that time, 1993. What caused that slow deterioration of those policies to slip back into, like, all that consolidation and everything you're talking about?
Yeah, it's always hard to really put your finger on these things. I mean, humans, we are, when whatever comes next looks back at us, they're going to say that they weren't really good at thinking ahead. You know, I don't know. It's mysterious to me because there are people out there who really work to try and make this a jobs versus environment, a people versus nature argument, and it just isn't. And if we had any interest in both those things, any true interest, we wouldn't have taken the path that we did. And it becomes about power, it becomes about consolidation of money and power, and then those people, those very few people, have the lobby, they have the voice of industry in quotes, but they don't. They have the voice of shareholders, and their interest is not the public interest at all. And we had a government that thought that was more important and put in place, you know, got rid of red tape, gave everything over to industry making decisions, and that wasn't good for jobs, and it wasn't good for the environment. And we absolutely have to get away from this dichotomy, the idea that, we absolutely need to move to thinking about both ecosystem and human well-being, health, and putting in places policies that actually foster both those things, because they're very synergistic, and the way we've gone is completely the opposite direction. And you know, this is the global issue. Short-term decision making made my people in power.
Short-term profits over
over maintaining a world that actually can maintain humans. And the climate piece is, I keep waiting for us to wake up. I see that there's been a shift in the conversation, but the conversation is not going to save us. The rate and scale of climate impacts already kill millions of people every year, and it's terrifying. I'm scared for my children. I don't understand why people manage to be able to live on another planet in their minds and not have that front and foremost in terms of, you know, keeping a healthy planet, keeping healthy ecosystems, putting those things first, because, you know, we knew all of this in the 70s. The Rio Biodiversity Summit was 30 years ago, which is kind of shocking. And, you know, if you read the intros and read those talks, I actually looked back at them just recently. We said exactly the same things that we're saying now, and we haven't put in place the changes, and most individual people want that to happen and frankly feel powerless. People are always contacting me and saying, well, what can I do? And I say, I don't really know, because contact your MLA. Well, the MLAs want the same thing. The people that I talk to, they want the same thing. They want these changes too. And yet somewhere there's somebody in a dark room pulling strings and making sure things don't happen. That's what I see.
Probably on a yacht, realistically.
Possibly.
Somewhere else.
True enough. They're not in a dark room.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I think it's really important in noting that, like, you and like your colleagues are some of like the reasons why we're having this conversation again 30 years ago. Like, if we can just circle back to the original Biodiversity in BC report, like the last stand for biodiversity, you're one of the main authors on that. That's kind of a big deal. You're kind of a celebrity. But one of the things that I really love about that paper that you all did, and then the strategic review, of course, from Gorley and Merkel, is that you encompass that very inclusive nature in all of it. Yet, you know, it's like every page of that report, of both reports, kind of talk about the need to bring in Indigenous nations for decision making, the need to expand into value-added wood stocks, the need to expand into, you know, valuing timber or valuing our forests for values beyond timber, for cultural, ecological, all these different values. And it's always like a very inclusive, like, we need to make this transition together. Yet industry continually takes that and spins it into that same age-old environmentalist versus loggers, and putting the jobs factored into it. Like, I guess, what was your motive in creating that report, and what did you kind of expect or hope to accomplish, and has it?
Well, it certainly got, we didn't expect what happened to happen. I guess nobody ever does with those kinds of things. I mean, literally, the Old Growth Strategic Review was underway, and COVID happened, and I didn't have any work to do, and I'd been deeply frustrated for the last 20 years that the province, actually I've been on multiple old growth panels for the last 20 years, as has Karen and Dave, where the province is supposed to put out the reports on the status of the forest and old growth, and they never do. They never release those reports. So I had been looking at pulling together a provincial database to do that work, and happened to talk to Karen about it. We met somewhere and mentioned it, and we thought, oh yeah, we're both frustrated. Our careers have kind of followed parallel lines, and so we felt like there needed to be a good summary of the state of the forest, because we have watched as weak policies have not been implemented, and we've been very, very concerned about the state of the forest. So we wrote the report with kind of no intention of it breaking out, but I think it really spoke to people, and it reflects what you see if you walk around with your eyes open, or if you get in a plane and fly over British Columbia. The rate of harvest is really has not declined, even though we've put in place parks and we've put in place old growth management areas, and we've done these supposed things. We've managed to put those things in places that really didn't protect the core of the forest. And it's really about flatland, low elevation forests, because those are the places that people like to log. It's where the big trees are, but it's also culturally where nations have often used the land primarily. And I say that because I've worked with lots of nations. It's where the trails often are. It's where your moose wintering habitat is. It's where your salmon streams are. It's where the productivity of the land is. And so all that biodiversity all kind of congregates in the productive ecosystems, and we have systematically not protected them. So we produced the report. We wanted to give some numbers to the Old Growth Strategic Review, and we decided that we might as well put it together and release it as a more public document, because we thought people would be interested, and we were pretty surprised to see it take off. But I think it really speaks to the fact that people are increasingly concerned about the state of the land again. We kind of veered off for 20 years where people were worried only about climate change and started to have markets and grow their own food. And now I've circled back to understanding that, we've really lost the plot in terms of forest management.
Well, it's pretty cyclical in that, like, it becomes a public issue, like all these issues, and it's in the newspaper for a couple months maybe, and then it kind of dies down and something else takes the limelight, and then eventually enough people stop talking about it that status quo just resumes.
Yeah.
And we were talking earlier, we were making the joke about you, Karen, and Dave being kind of the dream team in a way, being superheroes, having your own, like, you each had your different strengths that were able to come together and communicate this so well. I think it's just really cool to see it being brought up again. How do you think, or what are the kind of like the next steps that you see occurring, and what are you like fearful of not occurring? Like, do you think we're kind of going down that same slippery slope now that Fairy Creek's in a way fallen out of the media limelight? And
it's interesting. I think having hope and then having it removed is almost worse than not having hope. So that's one thing that has been a kind of a driving thing for me. I hear more and more around climate and forests that we are going to do things differently. And I've heard that a lot in the last 3 years. And so I'm hopeful, because The conversation is different. And I do believe that the conversation has to be different first before you can actually get a shift. So from that perspective, I'm hopeful. I also spent much of the last few months driving around the province and going, okay, well, I came here 20 years ago, or I came here 15 years ago, or I came here 25 years ago. And there was so much more opportunity then. We have, these valleys that were, there was so much more old growth then than there is now. It is phenomenal what we've done in my short life of working in this industry here. We are down to the last few percent in lots of places, and in some places we're beyond that. So I'm also really fearful that the status quo will just kind of beat it. I know I also saw more logging trucks in the last 3 months than I've seen ever on the roads, and I've talked to various different First Nation people who were out and about who said similar things. Northern Vancouver Island, there is frankly a concerted effort. That's what I could see to make sure it gets logged before someone gets to save it, because I think the writing is on the wall, and I think there's some level of, would I call it naivety or something? I don't know. There is a lack of on the ground change, and people don't understand that every month that passes without real underground change, we're losing irreversible biodiversity loss in these forests, and that I try not to think about that because it kind of makes you panic.
Do you want to set that up a little bit? Like, what exactly? Like, tell me a little bit about these forests. Like, what makes them so rich in biodiversity?
Well, we have forests in BC. Of course, the diversity of old growth is huge because we have very, very different forested ecosystems. And in many of the drier types, both in the southern and the interior of the province, we have almost no old growth left. It's really the opportunities for the paradigm shift truly lie in the wetter ecosystems, in the coastal temperate rainforest. We have the world's only unique, globally rare inland temperate rainforest, cedar hemlock, wet cedar hemlock forests. We have the northern spruce forests, big structured forests that naturally had a very large amount of old growth. So, they naturally had 60, 70, 80, 90% more dominated old growth in the natural ecosystem. And in those places, there's a relatively large amount remaining, although we have systematically harvested the most productive of all of those ecosystems. So even when there's 30% left, which there is in some of the wetter ecosystems, there's still only less than 5% of the the biggest forest types left. And we're planning to log all of it, pretty much, that's not in a park. And the biodiversity associated with that is often, it can be up to 10,000 years worth of soil development that has this diversity of species that we don't even know about. Huge carbon stores, maintains habitat for this incredible large mammal diversity that we see, but all the things in between and all the functions and that the forests provide, keeping the water flowing, keeping the water cool, keeping the water clean, like these really basic things, allowing species to move. That's going to be even more important with climate change. All of these functions and diversity that we have in these forests, they're totally gone when we log them and turn them into basically very simplified second growth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because of the 2.7% of the most productive big old growth forests that were remaining 2 years ago when you wrote the report, which is probably down to, I don't know, 2.5%, 2.4.
Yeah.
It's not like that's one big forest that's just happy. It's like they're all little bits kind of fragmented all over.
Right.
Like, tell me, like, what's the issue with habitat fragmentation like this, and like, especially in an era of climate, like, what's the big deal about that?
Yeah, well, it's the amount of old forest that is the most important thing in terms of because if you're an old growth dependent species, you have to move from A to B, and what we have is an extremely fragmented system. You know, you and I were chatting about even meeting here on Vancouver Island, and we're looking for some old forest to have this conversation in, and here we are in a park surrounded by stumps.
Right.
And so you know, the remaining old, so in the wetter areas where there is more remaining, you still drive for hours at lower, well, up to the mountaintops even. It's kind of amazing. With scattered patches of old remaining, and they don't provide a connected, functional forest ecosystem so that things can move. And I think people are always going, well, how much you need, and you know, how many nest boughs does a marbled murrelet population need? You know, that is such a reductionist way of thinking about the forest. It's very sciencey, and it's very driven towards driving to minimums. Like, how many do you need? I've heard that say, well, where do you want your medicinal plants exactly? And we can put them there for you, and then you can have them. Well, ecosystems don't work like that. We don't have, we have no idea how these forests really function. And we do know the closer to the natural distribution of forests, the better the chance that they're functional and resilient. But we have moved so far from the natural distribution and fragmented the forests so much that they aren't functioning. People across the province are concerned about large species disappearing. You know, we're one of the richest nations in the world, and we have pretty much wiped out mountain caribou from this landscape and old growth associated species by fragmenting the forest. And on paper, there's enough forest to maintain a population of caribou, but we didn't plan for, you know, we didn't think about fragmenting it and how are those species going to move. And we also ignored the fact that they needed low elevation old growth in bad years. So we didn't even manage for that. And then we're supposedly surprised that we have extirpated each of these little populations one by one. You know, I live in a town where there used to be a mountain caribou population, and now there isn't. And we should be ashamed of that. And we also should be horrified.
Right. Well, it goes back to this concept of shifting baselines, where it's like, you know, the state of California has a grizzly bear on their flag. The last grizzly was shot there in 1920 or something like that.
Yeah.
And I mean, so if you were growing up in Nelson now, you would never even know that there was a caribou population.
Exactly.
What's it like as we kind of move forward, and like, you know, you and I have been talking about like these big stumps of the firs around us that are rotting out. Like, as soon as those are gone, there's really going to be no trace of what kind of forest existed here. And I've heard you talk about your idea of ghost trees.
Yeah. I mean, humans, we're in a crisis situation where we're degrading all of our ecosystems and forgetting that they existed as they did a moment ago. And that is, I don't usually think much about in terms of human population health, but even from a simple human perspective, that is bad. It is bad for us. We're heating up the water. We're losing water. We know that water is going to be this huge issue going forward as the planet heats up, and yet we take no notice of that. And so each time the baseline shifts, we become even more at risk from the degradation of the ecosystem. And humans have become disconnected. And that is, we know that there is emotional and other impacts associated with that. But from a fundamental maintaining climate stability, for example, these forests have a huge role to play in that. And when we lose sight of what we've lost, then we're really on in a very poor. We just cannot manage well in that situation.
Mm-hmm. And that's where your concept of ghost trees comes in.
That's right.
So a ghost tree, if you would like to summarize that,
yeah.
I guess.
Yeah.
Because I feel like you're going to do it better than I can.
Well, so, Karen, Dave, and I did this analysis of the state of the forests. And one of the difficult things is we've logged a phenomenal amount of the forest. For instance, we found this amazing quote, and it's actually in one of our reports that's on the government website that probably nobody read because nobody reads reports anymore. But
certainly not ones on the government website.
But the old growth technical advisory panel, when we have some numbers and stuff around this issue on there, which you can download from the government website. But so if you're looking at how much old growth there is today, you can't, if you're looking at the associated risk associated with that, with the amount today, you have to look at each individual ecosystem, which has its own disturbance regime and has its own natural amount of old growth. And you have to compare it to what would have been there historically. And, in ecosystems like this, we're sitting on the east side of Vancouver Island right now, there is basically no old growth left. But every forest that you walk in right now, you can see the stumps of the massive Douglas fir and massive cedar that used to be here. Those ghost trees, you have to somehow factor that into the analysis to understand what has happened to the ecosystem and to understand that, the effect that's been had on the ecosystem. And so we call them ghost trees, and we analyzed for them by looking at the productivity of the forest and looked at the fact that the most productive sites have no old growth left on them often or very little. That's where the 3% number came from. And then, the least productive ecosystems with the little trees, those are all still in the data because we haven't harvested them, and they're typically within the natural range and doing quite well. But those forests have completely different functions, and there's nothing wrong with those forests. I'm not saying that they're bad forests or not important forests. They very much are important forests, but they're completely different forests. And you cannot, even within an ecosystem, you cannot lump those very different forests together. I was going to tell an anecdote about Cathedral Grove. So it's called the Macmillan Grove because Macmillan, it was started Macmillan Blodell, said, we should set aside some of these trees so that there are some left, so that people can remember what they look like. And there's a Maclean's article that we reference on one of our reports that says something to the effect of Cathedral Grove was not the largest and not by far not the most magnificent of the Douglas fir forests, but we decided we should set it aside now because it was the best that remained at that time. That Maclean's article was written, and I'm going to get the date wrong, but I think it was 1936. It could have been 1938. But at that time, Macmillan noted that the sliding baseline had occurred, that all the best Douglas fir were already gone at that point. And so, there are no intact Douglas fir forests anymore. And yet that used to be the dominant ecosystem in the South Coast.
Right. Yeah, I mean, of the biggest and largest protected trees now, there were cookies of trees larger than that were going around on trains to, to museums and to circuses as like these freak show trees.
That's right.
And now they're just non-existent.
That's right.
I actually heard a different version of that, though. I heard that Macmillan set that aside because apparently he was a fairly religious guy, and his priest at his church actually was like, said something to him about like those trees. Maybe they are like the last of the best. Like you need to protect those trees. So he did, not willingly, but he did under guidance of his priest, and that's why it's called Cathedral Grove, because they're God's trees.
Right. Excellent. I hadn't heard that one.
That's what was relayed to me. Man, I have so many questions. I'm just kind of going through this, and I know that you are in a time crunch, so I'm going to try to be quick about all this. Yeah, I guess going back to the biodiversity thing, because if we can kind of focus on this one subject here, that's what I find so misleading about all of the wide breadth of information that comes out, especially the industry's kind of skewed numbers where forest is forest and old growth forest is old growth forest. But like you said, every type of forest ecosystem is different. And a lot of the old growth forest that we have is high alpine areas, or it's in bog areas. It's these undesirable logging locations. And of the stuff that was highly desirable, we've already decimated that. And so these isolated pockets of old growth are separated by, traditionally clear-cut methods in our like Western society. And those forests, everybody says, oh, trees are going to grow back. Like that will be a forest in 100 years. In 250 years, it'll be an old growth forest, because that's what the government has deemed as an old growth forest ecosystem. But even within that action set, like clear cutting does drastic things to the hydrology of the area. Like it reduces the amount of water in the soil, so the forest that grows back isn't necessarily going to be even the same kind of Western hemlock cedar dominant type. Like, what does this mean in an era of climate change going forward? Like, how do we work to protect forests, these kind of forests in the interim, so that we can actually regrow second growth forests with old growth characteristics to increase this biodiversity at a time when we desperately need it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the remaining old growth are the kind of the refugia systems that have that diversity, and often they are fragmented enough that they may well, how many times do I spend standing in some tiny patch of forest on the edge of some river somewhere that's some ecological reserve, or some, is less than 10 hectares. It's
like 50 meters wide.
Crazy. So we don't even understand whether, how much has been lost from those remaining patches. But what is there, the diversity of species that is there gives us some hope that there's the possibility of regenerating forests, but that look like the previous ones. But the chances of that with climate change, you answered your own question in there. The way that we log and the way that we have harvested really gets rid of that. And our whole mindset of how forestry works has been to always simplify. If there's a deciduous species, let's kill it, let's spray it, let's cut it, let's get rid of it. We have
the old glyphosate issue.
Yeah, we have all this research that shows that that's bad, even if you only care about growing conifers, that, the deciduous understory, it has a role to play in the growing of the conifer trees. And yes, it might slow down the first 10 years, but it gives you a more resilient forest over time. We know these things. They've been in the literature. They've been advocated for the last 30 years. And again, we have paid no heed because it doesn't play well into the game of pretending that we've reached free to grow and pretending that there's this much wood coming in the forest. We use, I'm off track. That's not what you asked me, but I'm going to say this anyway because we pretend that the future forest, we have these productivity curves that measure the fastest, cleanest growing trees. And then we apply that, it's called the PSPL, the site productivity layer. We apply that to all the forest, and we're making an assumption that the future forest is going to grow 40% faster than the last forest. And there's some nuances in that, but we play these games so that the timber supply models are going to tell us that all the trees are going to live. There's going to be very little individual tree mortality, completely contrary to what we're seeing on the ground. We don't include the increase in fire in those models. We say, we'll adjust if it all burns, we'll adjust afterwards. We make all of these assumptions all to keep the harvest rate up, when that is the driving thing that has to change in order for us to switch it around and manage for ecosystem health. I've gone so off track, I can't remember what the original question was, but
well, I'm glad that you kind of brought it that way, because that's an interesting thing that I've always found so funny about the way that we operate forestry on Turtle Island, is that we're using all these kind of silvicultural practices derived in Germany. So that chart you're talking about, like, that was something that nobody had any scientific backing to.
Yeah.
They're just like, oh yeah, here's a graph, we're going to plant these trees and this is how they're going to grow, and this is how we're going to set our annual allowable cuts for the next 70 years, and let's see how it is. And now we, across the province and all of Cascadia, across like the nation, really, you have this horrible level of forests that are understocked based on the stock that they were expecting to get 70 years ago, 40 years ago. Like, so we've just created this system where we're seeing it in real time. We're seeing all these things, all these predictions of how much timber supply we would have. All of a sudden, we're not reaching that, and we're having to lean more on the production of old growth.
Well, that's right. I mean, I was on just north of Vancouver Island, and they were actually, they were harvesting old growth, massive ancient forests, and at the same time, they're harvesting these tiny, tiny poles that are completely overstocked, where the forest is going nowhere. It's kind of is stagnated. It's fallen into this trough, and it can't get out because it was really badly managed, and somebody wanted it to be a tree farm and screwed it up over huge swaths of the land base. So that is resetting even the timber supply projections, as you're saying, and it's a disaster out there. It's a disaster, frankly, from a timber management perspective, because if you're managing a household, you don't eat everything in the cupboard right away. You save a little. I just went on a kayak trip for 8 days. We had 9 days food. In fact, we had 10 days food, because it's really dumb to not plan with some budget to have
buffer there.
Yeah, but we do completely the reverse. All these models, they push. They're optimization models. They assume that we can get the best all the time. It's how we lost the cod on the East Coast. It's why, now we have a mountain pine beetle outbreak that is caused by climate change or exacerbated by climate change, but it would have been something else, right? There's always something. We always know there's always something. Nobody planned for that. And so now we have a 40-year timber supply gap, midterm timber supply gap. So Williams Lake or Prince George, they're sitting in this decimated landscape with no jobs and no moose.
Mm-hmm. Well, and a lot of that speaks to, like, from a timber supply perspective, we've been coming short on that for sure, but also like all the ecological problems that creates, like all those naturally regenerated hemlock forests that are super tight here on the coast anyway, like that's what's burning up in these fires, because that's what's creating the canopy fires and spreading rapidly. And the mountain pine beetle, that was like a good portion of that, or was pine forests that were cut and replanted and were similar age, and now they're susceptible to pine beetle spread, because they're all right. I could ramble about it.
Oh yeah. No, I mean, and there's the endless kind of rhetoric of things that don't make any sense but seem to get legs and run around. So one of them is, you should cut your old growth because it's going to burn.
Or it's unproductive.
Panic. It's panic. Let's panic. And it makes no sense, because if that old growth stand has withstood the last fire regime for the last 400 years or 1,000 years or 5,000 years, it's likely to stay there. So it's in a landscape position that's good. And it also, you have never walked into an old growth forest and thought, oh, it's warmer than it was outside. These forests are cool. 10 degrees cooler on a hot day, and they burn less. And there's science on that, and yet there are folks out there spreading the alternative rumor and saying, oh, we need to cut it all now before it burns. And it doesn't make any science sense, and it doesn't make management sense, and it certainly doesn't make ecosystem health sense.
Well, and I've seen that too with a lot of fire buffers and fire thinning they're doing, going into these like overstocked forests and then still taking the biggest and the best old growth trees, trying to thin it out and make it more fire resilient. But even that's just taking the most market worthy trees out of these ecosystems. It's just another loophole.
Exactly. It is just another loophole. And the only way out is the paradigm shift, where we view the forest as something different, that provide services that, keep the water on the hillsides and all of that. And because if we don't shift the mental framework, and there are many foresters in the province, and many managers in the province who have the shift, who already know this, and I talk to a lot of them. And there are also an astonishingly large number who are living in the 1970s. It remains perpetually shocking to me how uneducated people are around ecosystems and the value of ecosystems, and yet they push as though their job is to, district managers, I know some personally, they push as though their job is to maintain the timber industry. And I'm always at a loss as to why that has been the way the forest industry has developed in the province. This should be a true public interest agency that puts these other values first. And now we've said we're going to do that. I'm interested to see how that plays out.
Well, I mean, isn't there... So you can have two different blocks managed by two different forest managers with different perspectives, different philosophies, if you will, on how to manage it. Are there no policy incentives to incentivize more ecological or well-rounded style of management versus that kind of old school timber supply management?
Yeah, well, that's what we need to bring in. We need to make it pay to do more with less. I mean, that, and it's possible to do that. And there's first of all, we need to disincentivize shipping rough cut timber out of the province, right there, so that we are getting the jobs from, it's all about enabling. We know how to do the forest health piece. We just don't do it because we're so focused on timber volume. We're not focused on job value or timber value. We're interested in timber volume. And so we need to disincentivize the bad things. We need to disincentivize cutting to stream banks. It should actually be illegal to do these things. People don't understand that it's not illegal to make species extirpated, which is kind of amazing. It's not illegal to we have such a extraordinarily perverse set of wording in the legislation. So there's things like material adverse impact. You're not allowed to have a material adverse impact. Okay, what is that? Well, actually the definition of that is whatever the policy says it is. So your material adverse impact, if it says you can log something, you can put a oil well, for instance, in an old growth management area. Well, because that's allowed, it's not classed as a material adverse impact. These circular and extraordinarily obtuse legislative pieces that were written by, somebody clever, but not somebody interested who was interested in actually maintaining the intent of things. We need to shift the balance so that we're interested in actually maintaining these values.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the thing, is the whole industry was established a certain way, and even with what you were mentioning, after the 90s, that kind of amalgamation of or the conglomerates of logging companies owning massive tenures and the shutting down of local mills, and then you have these big mills that operate in whole regions that. and then in order to keep that mill alive and operating, you have to have a constant supply of timber, which doesn't necessarily allow for any innovative or different ways of thinking about how to manage that timber. You kind of have to keep a minimum annual allowable cut, if you will, to like flow into those in order to maintain the status quo of resources and jobs. But like you've said before, like what's the job to tree ratio here in BC, and how can we be doing it better?
Yeah, well, we have, the lowest jobs per tree cut anywhere in Canada. You just have to look at StatsCan to see those numbers. And, we have, the number is actually probably less than 1, but I usually say it's less than 2 to make sure I'm not wrong, but it's really low. 2 jobs per cubic meter. The Scandinavian countries are really high.
Is that per cubic meter of timber pulled
Yes, that's right. And a cubic meter is about a telegraph pole, telephone pole worth. And
so that creates 2 jobs here in BC.
Yeah. And
in Scandinavia, it's
20, 30.
Wow.
Yeah.
Where else in Canada? You said it's the lowest in BC.
So BC has the lowest jobs per cubic meter compared to the rest of Canada as well. So they do better in Ontario. They do better across Canada than we do here, and it's because we have not changed. We kind of haven't changed what we're doing here. We're just cutting down trees and thinking a 2x4 is the answer, primarily. And of course, there are some good examples. So there are some local mills in the Kootenays, for instance, who really do try and get the right mill and the right log in the same place, and so they get more value. But we haven't done that switch to the need to do more with less. That's a crucial part of that. And, if I was in charge, am I not in charge? No, I'm not in charge. But if I was in charge, I would cut the timber supply in half immediately. I would actually make sure that we maintain these ecological values, because this global uniqueness is phenomenon. But at the same time, I would assign half of that timber to value-added companies, and you could apply for it. It doesn't right now. The majors are in charge of what happens to the wood out there, and so they don't allow the development of value-added. It's been a very interesting last 2 years. I've spent a lot of time talking to a lot of people who are interested in these solutions, and people want to invest $20 million in a local, relatively small or mid-sized value-added facility, but cannot get guaranteed wood flow. So that's what that is about. So take it away from those big companies who, frankly, are going to go when it's gone anyway, and shift it to this value-added piece so that those companies can truly invest. And there can be some old growth logging, but honestly, nothing should be clear cut, harvested, so that you could have a period of transition. But you need to reduce the harvest significantly in those places to maintain the vast majority of the remaining old forest that's out there for its carbon stores. And the world is looking to pay to keep forests like this standing up. The possibility of carbon credit financing to maintain some of these values. There is lots of schemes being developed worldwide for carbon and biodiversity financing. I have some concerns about the idea that those things would allow the fossil fuel industry to continue, but it's also relatively simple to make sure that you don't sell your carbon credits to people who are exacerbating the climate somewhere else. Like, climate neutral is problematic in itself, and that's a whole other conversation. But there are these opportunities, and we're logging this forest for so little public gain. And First Nations are, in my view, being treated yet again unfairly, being handed a tiny fraction of the value instead of looking at the bigger picture and developing the more jobs piece combined with other financing mechanisms, the world will pay us in British Columbia to keep these amazing forests standing, and yet we're racing to the bottom of the curve to log them before that gets developed. We're doing our very best to make sure that doesn't happen.
Especially in an era when like we've committed, quote unquote, to UNDRIP, and a lot of the relations with First Nations are still just kind of smoke and mirrors. It's the same consent by coercion. When like these nations have been left impoverished by like 100+ years of colonization, and then are all of a sudden given two relatively minuscule choices.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's deeply problematic. I work for a lot of nations, and it's not my place to speak on their behalf and to talk about the specifics, but I can tell you that the way these policies are being rolled out are they're yet another way of creating divisiveness between nations and giving them really a Hobson's choice that is no choice. You have to have an alternative, to the industrial model that we have in place, so that you're not forcing nations into choosing between things that they have many, many, many times before said they don't want to eat.
Right. And I think it's worth noting too that in the conversation around maintaining the status quo of logging that industry commonly makes, it's all done for the sake of jobs and economy in these small communities. But like you've said, like the number of people actually employed is so minimal. And then at the same time, these are publicly traded companies whose primary goals or motivation is acting on behalf of their shareholders. And you can look across the board at the historical, like just over the past 20 years at companies like Canfor and stuff, and they're like investing in hardwood mills down in Oklahoma, and they're slowly pulling out of BC. So while at the same time when they are like saying you can't end old growth logging here in BC because it's going to reduce jobs and it's going to close down these small towns, they're actively engaging and pulling out and going elsewhere in the world because it's better for their shareholders.
Yep. There's only a yep to that.
No comment. All right.
There is no comment to that.
3 questions here because I know you have to go. So if you could tell me a little bit, like, what are the barriers to progress and what can we do to kind of keep pressure on and maintain progress? Like, what are the changes that you need to see or that you think should be happening right now?
Oh, that was a lot of questions all in one question.
I've got 2 more of those.
Well, the barriers, I don't know what the barriers are. The barriers are fear. I think the political barriers are fear. I know that the world of people out there is, we are the population, and it's probably in every community on some level, is split between those who are scared of change and those who are scared of not change. And I'm definitely in the category that I'm scared of not changing because I see truly dire consequences if we don't. And we haven't talked at all about the actual just intrinsic value of these phenomenal forests. I'm sitting here talking as a scientist, but as a human being on this planet, like, what are we doing? What are we doing? Like, so we're frightened of making these changes, and yet humans never make change unless they have to. So what we need is leadership. And we need leadership from government, and they've said they're going to do these things, and yet there's a lot of talk. I have stood personally in a lot of deferral blocks that we identified that government said should be deferred, that have not been deferred, that have been logged, that, I think people don't understand the rate and scale of harvesting, and they don't understand that, for instance, First Nations may not have time to have responded to some of these things, that they're being put in a terrible position of contrast between each other. So we've started down this path of change, but we haven't actually really made most of the changes yet that we've talked about. And the time is now, right? We have to get on with this. We have to stop talking about it and stop playing games around it and do what we know to be the right thing to do. So that's what I think needs to happen. I don't know what the second half of the question was now. You That's really it. We need to get on with doing what we've been talking about for the last 30 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because this is the second old growth strategic review.
That's right. And they say they're going to put out some other new consultation with the public, like really, I'm trying to understand that change is slow and difficult, but my frustration level personally is it's pretty high because I watched this before. I watched this happen 30 years ago, and as we talked about earlier, change was coming, and then we went back into the dark ages, and we just cannot afford to do that.
Right. Well, the change that needs to happen takes a really long time to implement, and the way that things continue to move just happens so fast.
Yeah, that's right.
So what can the average person do to, I guess you kind of answered this at the beginning. You said you didn't know, but if you had, I guess not what the average person can do to, maybe just thinking about this differently, to not only keep pressure on the governments and stuff, but is there anything that people can do in their own day-to-day lives? Like if you're a local builder, is that would you advise people to look into local mills and stuff?
Oh yeah,
value-added timber.
Yeah, no, that's totally true. I mean, I just built a house and I bought as much of the wood as I could from the local community forest that actually gets, they said 11 jobs per cubic meter.
Which is great.
Howard Proctor Community Forest, right? And so we need to push for those things happening. Of course, they do happen from the bottom, but they really need leadership to make them happen from the top. I fear what's coming is kind of the war in the woods of 93, but worse, because people are more desperate and the situation is more desperate. So, I think that's coming. I think Fairy Creek will not be the last of the people on the ground being active, but, I think it is very true that forests can provide a sustainable resource if we do it well. We just haven't done it well. So there's nothing wrong with wood as a good product. And yes, it's better than steel and concrete, and we need to think like that. But we need to shift so radically in how we create the product that the amount of waste that happens and all of those pieces. I mean, that's an endless conversation, but definitely individual life choices are important, but making sure government understands that this is important to you is really important.
And I guess I'll make this my final question, but based on what you see from the younger generation of foresters and stuff coming up, are you optimistic to there being a truly sustainable forest industry that we can create in the future?
Oh dear, he asked me a question at the end, and I'm supposed to end on something positive, I'm sure. And I can take that back. That was not great. No, I'm not positive at all about that, because I see a terrible education system where we learn about...
Even still, you don't think it's evolved at all?
It's evolved, but it's not evolved enough.
Right.
I talk to people in their 30s. I had somebody the other day tell me that I didn't need to worry about climate change because it was covered in ice 10,000 years ago.
Right.
And that was a
Those
forester.
Arguments, yeah.
That was kind of a bit mind-blowing to me. I speak with young foresters all the time, and I had someone the other day tell me that the old growth forest is decadent and must be harvested because it's a forest health issue.
Still.
And that person was in their 30s.
Wow.
And I also see a lot of people who don't think like that. But we have a huge swath of mid-level bureaucrats who grew up in a different world and haven't figured out that it's changed, and they need to get with the times. And I don't know. So I try to maintain positivity because you might as well. And because my two children, who are 15 and 19, because I'm scared for them. I genuinely am scared for them. And So I need to be positive about the fact that change is possible. And I think we have a huge, big thing to happen. And I think we need real leadership. And I see it everywhere. I see the potential for it everywhere. And I see that the people with the power still often are not those people. And I wonder where we're going. But I try and maintain my positivism. Otherwise,
yeah. The world's a lot darker of a place if you're not positive, not a little bit optimistic. Is there anywhere people can go to learn more information on this stuff, to get more out of it? Any people you'd like to plug doing great things?
Oh my goodness, there's lots of fantastic people. Of course, there are. Well, there is the government website on old growth, and I say that because it has changed. And there's been some acknowledgement that there are different forest ecosystems. We don't yet manage for them, but noticing that they exist is really good.
That's a step in the right direction.
We created a map that is up there that anybody can download and use. Well, actually, you need to have GIS, unfortunately, but that takes all the old growth forests and divides it into size classes. So, for instance, for every ecosystem, it identifies the small old growth and the large old growth. And that's super useful in your local region. People don't know that it exists, but I think that's pretty useful. And always being as informed as you can be is the way to go. So there's lots and lots of resources on the values and amazing things that are in our forests. And I highly recommend a walk in the forest because I just spent the last week paddling around Brooks Peninsula and looking at that ecosystem. It's actually a relatively low productivity piece of Vancouver Island, no doubt. Why it was set aside as a park, it's also biodiverse and phenomenal endemic species out on the point. But it was absolutely amazing to me because everywhere I looked, I could see the natural diversity in the forest, and there was old growth. It was every single piece of it was old growth forest, and it went from little tiny trees to trees that were 6 meters across, all naturally interspersed with each other. I saw more bears there than I've ever seen anywhere. Stumbled across bear dens every time I walked into the forest. The diversity was phenomenal. The niches and the microsites were amazing. I highly recommend finding some old growth forest and going and walking in it and looking at the amazement of nature.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.
Appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. I know it's been a long day, but hopefully you'll be able to get a nice sunset paddle in here.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks again to everybody for joining in on yet another episode of the Nerdy About Nature podcast. Really appreciate every one of you for tuning in here. It's great to hear of so many people being so receptive to a lot of really great information about the world that we all share so we can create a better world for all of us here. If I'll just take another moment here and plug this, Nerdy About Nature, it's an independent passion project that requires quite a bit of energy, effort, and work to make all come together. So if you're enjoying this stuff, you can do me a favor by liking it up, rating it up, sharing it around to all your friends and family, supporting it by getting some merch at nerdyaboutnature.com, or ideally by becoming a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/nerdyaboutnature, because that gives me the kind of financial stability to just keep putting more energy into this and growing this, and ideally, getting to a point when I can hire people to help with research and writing and all that stuff. But it takes a lot of work right now, and it's just me. So if you're enjoying these podcasts and all the Instagram stuff, all the fun educational videos, all the fun facts, we'd really appreciate your support. And if not, no worries. Just stoked to have you here anyway, because the more people know and learn about this stuff and this world that we all share, then the more people there are acting in ways to protect it and keep it great. So thank you all very much for tuning in, and I will check you here in a couple weeks when I have another great podcast lined up. Take care.